everyone. My name is Brooke Sheets, and I'm the Senior Librarian for the Children's Literature Department of the Los Angeles Public Library. I want to thank you for joining us today for our annual Focal Award celebration. As you know, today is Juneteenth, a commemoration of the end of slavery in the United States and our newest federal holiday. I'm so pleased that today we get to recognize the life and legacy of Biddy Mason while celebrating this year's award-winning title, Biddy Mason Speaks Up. But you'll hear more about that later. Now, I'd like to introduce you to board member Doey Reyes, who will be speaking today on behalf of Focal. When not serving as Focal Point's editor or taking care of her cats and pug, Doey works as an early educator where she uses her master's in educational psychology to share her love of reading and books with her students. Doey?
Hi, Brooke. Thank you for introducing me. And welcome everyone to the 42nd Annual Focal Award. Focal, which stands for Friends of Children in Literature, is the Friends group for the Children's Department at Central Library. And you might wonder, why does the Children's Department need its own Friends group? Well, in the 1970s, there were threats of closing the children's room. But in 1979, a group of teachers, librarians, and parents who were committed to protect that space for children at Central Library got together and formed Focal. Today, Focal continues to support the department's goals and programming by fundraising and the purchase of materials and equipment. Members of Focal support the department through membership fees, book sales, and other fundraising events and programs. The Focal Award was devised as a way to bring recognition to the Children's Department and one of its special collections, the Californiana. Each year, a book with significant California content is recognized for excellent literary merit and universal appeal for children in grades 3 through 8. With a message from the committee, I'll introduce you to Focal Board member Michelle Moreau, who is here to speak about the award committee process.
Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Moreau, and this year I served on the Focal Award Committee as Chair Emeritus. I would like to thank the ladies on the committee who diligently did the work of reading and evaluating all the nominated books, which included fiction, nonfiction, picture books, and chapter books, so that we could honor the winner today. Now it's my privilege to present the Focal Award Committee of 2021. Our chairwoman, Kate Aronson, Focal President, Carolyn Gill, committee members Marie Moreau, Rocio Quesada, Sarah Rebman, Bazia Samuels, and Alice Schock. It is also my pleasure to announce next year's award committee chair, Kristen Piers. Thank you, Kristen, for agreeing to be our committee chair, and I'm sure you'll do great. The award committee's work began late in 2020, with its members reading all the titles nominated for the award. We were looking for just one good book, suitable for children in grades 3 to 8 that would rise above the others in terms of literary and artistic merit, interest and readability, universality, and California enrichment content. This was not an easy task, as our nominations included many wonderful titles. The committee met via Zoom in February, and after debating over 3 finalists, we were able to determine without a doubt this year's winner, Biddy Mason Speaks Up. Beautifully written and illustrated, this book presents a timely and uplifting message about racial justice while exemplifying the high standards for the Focal Award. Today, we are happy to present virtually our annual Focal Award to the 2 co-authors and illustrator of this outstanding book. Now I'd like to turn the program back over to Doey and our 2021 award recipients.
Thanks. I'm so excited to introduce you to the authors. Laura Atkins is a children's book author, editor, teacher, and director of Manzanita's Children's Book Hub. She co-wrote Fred Korematsu Speaks Up and Biddy Mason Speak Up for the Fighting for Justice series. And she has won many awards and spoken to over 8,000 students. And she is here to speak to all of us. Thank you for joining us. Also, Arisa White, who is an assistant professor of English and creative writing at Colby College and Cave Canem Fellow. She is the author of Who's Your Daddy Who and co-editor of Home is Where You Queer Your Heart and co-author of Biddy Mason Speaks Up. Thank you for joining us. Laura Freeman's book illustrations have been recognized with an NAACP Image Award, a Coretta Scott King Illustrator Honor, reached the New York Times bestseller list, and has been honored by the Society of Illustrators, the Georgia Center for the Book, and the Annuals for Communication Arts and American Illustrations. Thank you for joining us. And side note, when you download the newest Focal Points, which is our quarterly newsletter from our website, focalcentral.org, you can find links to learn more about their work. Laura A, Arisa, Laura F, it's so nice to be able to have you and speak with you about your work. We have some questions from Focal members, the award committee members, and we'd like to chat with you. But before we start, I'd love to hear, where are you talking to us from? Laura A, I know you're from somewhere special today.
Yeah, I live in Berkeley, California, usually, so a little north from you all, but we're at a camp near Boonville, which is up in the North Coast near Mendocino. I'm doing an art and music camp, so that's where I'm coming from today.
That's really exciting.
Yeah.
And Laura F., where are you joining us from?
Hi, I'm in Atlanta, actually in Marietta, which is a little north west of Atlanta.
And Arisa?
I'm in central Maine, Augusta, the capital of Maine, and moved here about 3 years ago. I was living in Oakland, California.
So exciting. I think ever since our programming went virtual, we have the opportunity to chat in a way that we would not have been able to any other year. So we're really excited that you're able to make the time to join us from everywhere. And to start our conversation about the book, I would love to hear about what brought you to this project, and how did you hear about it, etc. Laura A., would you like to start?
Sure, yeah. So I ended up getting involved with the writing of Fred Korematsu Speaks Up, which is the first book in the Fighting for Justice series, which I co-wrote with Stan Yogi. And I was brought into that because I have a children's book background. I was a children's book editor for a long time, and ended up, it became a kind of co-writing situation. And then at the end of that, and I think Stan is watching, he said he was going to watch, he lives in LA. Stan there were more books in the series, and it really was modeled on a book that he had co-written called Wherever There's a Fight. That's a book for adults about the fight for civil liberties in California history. So this series kind of was created as an idea of making that accessible to younger readers. And Biddy Mason was the second choice, so before I came on board. And then Stan, after Fred Korematsu Speaks Up, said he wasn't an aspiring children's book author. It was a lot of work, and he decided to step back. And Heyday Books, the Berkeley-based publisher that is publishing the series, asked if I wanted to write the next book. And I talked to people and ended up feeling like I wasn't comfortable as a white woman writing a book about an enslaved woman by myself. And so I proposed to Heyday that we look for another co-writer, and we did a little kind of search, and Arisa was recommended by our friend Aya De Leon. And so that's how the kind of project happened. Yeah, that's the story.
And I said yes. And and that's pretty much like how I got introduced to Biddy Mason. I didn't know very much about her life, not at all, really. So this was an exciting opportunity to kind of go into those archives, as well as kind of fulfill one of my dreams of writing a children's book, particularly in verse. So this was a beautiful opportunity.
And Laura F., how did you become involved?
Well, I'm grateful that Heyday, the editors and art director at Heyday, contacted me. And if it wasn't for Laura and Arisa, that I wouldn't know anything about Biddy Mason. So it's always really exciting. That's one of the best parts of doing children's book biographies, is being introduced to people that I had known nothing about before.
And Laura, if you've illustrated a lot of books in biographies, and my class we've read a few of them. Uh, in your illustrations, you always capture important details of the narrative, and like both highlight the joys and the sorrows in Biddy's life and in your other books. How do you decide what details to highlight in your illustrations?
Well, of course, it definitely depends upon the author's words. I'm really going from that. And then I like to dig a little deeper and do a little research for visual cues as well. But in this case, it was a little bit different because Laura and Arisa both sent me a lot of information. They did a lot of research and helped me out so much. They sent me photographs online. I had no idea what a Tongvan house was. They sent me pictures of that to put in the background of one of the images, pictures of what the cotton fields look like, and the general stores from back then, and cowboy dress. So it was really a collaborative effort.
That was also one of my most interesting parts. Like, how much did you all work together to make, because there's so many different parts to this book. How did you work together to make all these parts work so well? Who would like
one of the things that I'd like to credit them with also is including the California flower, the poppy, in the illustrations, because that wasn't my idea, but I thought it worked beautifully. And so I included the poppy in different stages. In the very beginning image, it's just like a little tiny bud. And by the last illustration, it's fully open.
I missed that.
Oh, see? It's always fun to find stuff like that, right? You got to look over things over and over again.
I think a few of us will have to. I see it now. Arisa, as a published poet, the verses share so much of the narrative and so beautiful. How was this research and composition process different than your typical work?
I mean, in the sense that this is a historical individual. It required me going to the library, really just researching in all sorts of ways. One of the challenges we had with Biddy Mason's story is that there's not a lot of information about her except in her later life. When she's a part of, when she, her slave owners convert to Mormonism, and then there's these records that the Mormons kept, which were incredible. So it was kind of exciting to think about, here is a particular life that we know about because of her effect on Los Angeles and the pioneer community. But what do we know about the earlier parts of her life? So I, in many ways, had to work backwards with the facts that Laura and I found, and begin to think about how to reconstruct childhood, because that's our audience, right? So what's the best way to connect to a younger audience is to situate this narrative in her childhood years, her young adult years, and really bring her up, because I think that was one of the challenging things and exciting things about writing Biddy Mason's life, is that how do you create that interiority? How do you show that Biddy Mason was a child and she was enslaved, and what was her life like on a daily basis? What did she need to know and learn in order to become a midwife and a healer, right? So it was just really exciting taking the facts of her life and then going into history books, the Library of Congress, all of that, and just really thinking about how to reconstruct this life so young people can feel a part of it, can grow and learn through her particular life as well. And one of the exciting things that, Laura and I were able to kind of rest in was the fact that what Biddy Mason's story forced us to do was to tell a kind of multi-history, right? Like there's not one kind of charismatic figure in this story. Yes, there's Biddy Mason, who is central, but so many people, so many laws, so many different things happening in the culture at the time were making it possible for Biddy Mason to become free, for Biddy Mason to be a midwife. So it was just really exciting just going into the archives, into these historical silences and animating it with all of the historical research that so many scholars have done over the years.
Would you like to add?
I can add to that too, because there was having done the Fred Korematsu book, and Fred Korematsu's story is in the 1900s. It's around World War II. His daughter is still alive, so he was able to give us a lot of information. So we had a lot of facts on the record, whereas with the Biddy Mason story, it's obviously set much further in the past. There was a lot less known. So Arisa and I must have spent months before we actually started writing the book, figuring out how we were going to even tell the story. And in part making the decision to kind of make up a life for her, which we didn't do with the Fred Korematsu story. Everything in that was from the record. Nothing was made up. But we felt like we couldn't approach telling this story in that way because we just didn't have enough. And so for kids to really be able to read and connect to Biddy Mason as a character and the people around her. So then the challenge was how to tell it in a way where readers are very firmly oriented and aware of what is being made up and what is factual. And then giving the resources at the end so that, teachers and kids can go find, where did we get the information and maybe dig deeper themselves, which is an opportunity to kind of enact how exciting it is to do the research and write a book. As you find, like there was one picture of historic Los Angeles that we include in the book, which is where Biddy Mason's homestead is. And it's this, first of all, just very cool old picture of Los Angeles, where it's like vineyards and orange trees and the mountains in the background. You almost are like, Los Angeles? But when you find that original map, it's like super high definition and huge. So like you can go in and be like, oh, what's at the corner of, 4th and 5th and here? So like I love thinking of kids getting to go and then dive in themselves, right? So that it's hopefully empowering readers to like feel more ready to do research themselves.
I mean, I'm a grown-up and I saw that map and I realized like I used to work there. That's really close to our library. And we visit the library and we might not know what a deep history there is in that spot. So I think it worked, at least for me, to read about it. And one of the, I think, adding on to what you said about it, one of the things that I found interesting was the naming practices and how learning that history of naming children after a grandparent and how that allowed you to add the story of Granny Allen at that part of the story. That was a really interesting piece of information that I read the poem and accepted it, and then learning more about the research process through the other sections. And I think that brings me to my question about the decisions you made about layout and how to add definitions and timelines. How did you all decide how to do that, or when?
Yeah, so that came from the Fred Korematsu book. So when I was first brought on board, and Stan had been working on it and was writing it as a kind of typical prose biography, with chapters. And we did work with 4th graders who we sort of had in mind. We went and did a presentation to 4th graders and introduced the story. But my background in children's publishing and as an editor was often working on books that used lots of different kind of points of access. So I was at Children's Book Press in San Francisco when we did I See the Rhythm, which maybe some librarians will remember. It won the Coretta Scott King Award way back in the 90s, but that had beautiful art by Michelle Wood, and then poems by Toyomi Igas, who's in Los Angeles, and we had definitions for musical songs, and then a timeline. And so I kind of brought that idea in for the Fighting for Justice series books as a way, in part when we're doing biographies of individuals, but it's around people who have fought for civil rights, and feeling like we don't not wanting to be too individualistic about it, right? If we're telling about movements and you're just telling one person's story, it can feel kind of counter to the message. So by having that format, you can go off on these stories about other people or community. And I think the idea with the definitions is just helping kids understand words. But it turned out, especially in this, and Arisa can talk more to this, but the definitions ended up being a real tool for us. You know, in terms of even coming to grips ourselves with some of the terms and ideas that we were grappling with.
Yeah, I think the format is just this wonderful way to be in conversation in the way that history happens. It's not singular, it's coming from multiple directions. But what it does kind of visually is it lets you know that this is a narrative along many other narratives, and look how they intersect. And then I think it also gives readers, it sort of builds the sort of critical intelligence of how to hold multiple narratives, right? And how do we integrate them to better understand the realities that we're in? And the definitions were so important, even in terms of like, I mean, like one of the interesting challenges in even writing in verse about Biddy Mason was, as a poet, I very much rely on kind of abstract metaphors. So I really had to be direct and really situate everything in the tactile and the senses and the everyday. So I had to learn to remove myself from the abstraction that jargon can create in our interactions with each other. So with, you know, Laura and I really trying to distill these definitions, it was about how do we create a kind of common language, a place where we can stand at least comfortably and able to have these most difficult conversations. Let's create some agreements around some terms. And so that really required us like reading a lot of cultural studies stuff, a lot of social justice, you know, like online sites as well as books to really get a sense of how these definitions have shifted and changed over the years. And, you know, what you start to really see is that language is so slippery, it's so dynamic, and it's always changing. And if you can show that, then I think young people can see that they have a role in how we shift and change language, meaning, and how we make meaning and how we create new symbols.
I mean, it was beautiful to read and to learn. I think one of the things that came up for me as you were both saying the many narratives that came together was how in our history textbooks we learn about slavery, about migration, about Native people, but not how they all connect to each other. And so much of this story was that connection, how she learned from the enslaved women, how she learned from the Native people. And it was so beautiful. And you said there was not a lot of historical information that connected them, but can you tell me more about that? How you found the connections between the people and the stories?
I think it's Biddy Mason's life, you know, and I think there's just her being a midwife and a healer. I knew that what would be the kind of access point for me in the sense of, it's hard, like, you know, as a Black woman going into history and dealing with enslavement and all of the abuses and violences. And then, you know, and then when you see the realities that are still present currently. So one of the joys that I was able to kind of sink into when working on this book was that Biddy Mason was a healer. She was a midwife. She had a literacy for the environment. So even though the institution of slavery said you cannot read, she could read the plants and the leaves. And she knew the history of that from, you know, one of the things about, you know, having to kind of do historical research is learning about the social structure of the plantation, that, you know, enslaved people organized themselves with a level of intelligence and care in order to pass on traditions, in order to pass on, in order to like educate how to hold and love your spirit, how to like stay alive in this system that's trying to kill you. So this was an education system that was happening within this society. And that's what I got to learn. And so you learn about an apprentice system, that apprentice model. And so in order for Biddy Mason to be a midwife, she learned that from an older woman. And then the whole naming practices and all of that, you know, just really linking those traditions to say that, like, here are people finding ways to pass down their traditions, even when a system is trying to destroy them. They are passing down ways to heal, ways to love, ways to care, ways to resist, and ways to survive and continue to dream. And so I think, you know, in having to think about the historical context that shaped and created a person like Biddy Mason, you have to think about the indigenous. You have to think about the laws, about migration. What was the American government doing to disenfranchise the indigenous people, create wealth for white men, right? Like, all of these things are operating to create social systems and structures that are going to narrate how we think about ourselves as Americans, as the form, you know, how we create a United States. So Biddy Mason's stories disabuse us of the reality that this is the single story, that we have to look from multiple angles in order to construct the life. And we wouldn't be doing this story justice if we didn't do that, you know, in some ways.
Yeah, and to add to that, we also had the help and support of many historians and experts and scholars today. We used a lot of, we just got a lot of input. So like Abdi Sultani, who's the head of the ACLU of Northern California, gave input about kind of the legal structure and gave us some suggestions of what to include. Susan Anderson, who is the head curator now, I think, at the California African American Museum, but at the time was at the California Historical Society. She knows more about Black history in California than anyone in the world. And so she was able to give us books and resources that really helped to paint a picture, say, of Los Angeles and the free Black community and the way people interacted with each other and the role of the church. And so we kept learning about people who we did know were connected to each other. And we know that, is it Jameson, who was the woman that was that we feature in the story, who was in Salt Lake City, but ends up in San Bernardino. Like, you start to almost have this web or a map, right, where you have the different people, or the Judge Hayes, you know, and then they have their own like kind of tendrils of connection. So part of the fun of it is, like, you know, it's almost like a crime scene, right, where you're like putting up the pictures and like this person gets that person, but it like brings this sort of period of time to life. And then you get, yeah, the pictures of like the place and the photos of the general store and you know, or what was it like where they went to camp in the mountains? What was the weather like? It was freezing cold that day, you know, just that's part of the fun, is like the people, the places, the plants, the animals, and just making sure we're getting it as right as we can. And having it be historically accurate as much as we can.
And how do you keep it all organized as you're working from two different sides of the country?
Well, we weren't. We were in Oakland together. God, I can't imagine having done this. I mean, we spent a lot of time in that bike cafe. What was it? The time, like sitting around talking. And you have a way you kept it organized?
I had a whiteboard. So one of the, like, once we figured out Biddy Mason's timeline from birth to death and all of the sort of major events that happened in between, I had this whiteboard that I just kept up on my wall for like 2 years as we were working on the project, just to make sure that, you know, we're remaining historically accurate, and where was this and what was going on at that time. So that helped. I have about like 3 notebooks that I kept, just meticulous notes. I was just going back, you know, citations, so many citations. I was, you know, we were reading stuff from all over. So it was just like really keeping track of and crediting photos and the authors we're reading and little pictures and audio that we heard. So it was just visual elements as well as a lot of notebooks and creating, you know, indexes that I can make sense of later.
So how long was the process from being invited to write to publishing, and what time did you all come in?
You remember, Arisa? Let's see.
I think sometime like my first notebook starts like August 2016. So, and then we kind of finished in 2018, just before I left Domain. So,
right. And then the book came out in 2019 because it's such a long time between when you have to finish everything. Then it has to get designed, and then it has to go to printer, and it gets printed overseas, and then it has to get shipped over. So you know, sometimes it's 6 months to a year before the pub date and when you actually finish.
Do you get to see the layout and like do approvings, or is it once you've written it, then it's in the hands of an editor?
Yes, and our editor was with us along the way as well. Molly was great, like just really helping us decide. You know, at one point we were thinking of writing this in first person, and then Molly's like, no, third person. So we had that editorial voice along the way, but then yes, more people started to come in as we got further along and closer to finish. But yeah, we saw the layout, we saw the art, everything.
Yeah. And I should shout out to Sharia Mosley, who was another advisor, who was recommended by Ebony Thomas. They had worked together on PhD research and looking at the representation of slavery in children's books. And Sharia was just amazing at really specific detail, constantly the language we were using, you're centering whiteness here, or you know, the way we were representing the story. She really profoundly helped shape the way we told it.
Yeah, and really even, you know, kind of encouraged for us to kind of think about ways to talk about elements of slavery and the institution of slavery that have been left out of children's books, right? So it's like, we don't want to have smiling, happy slaves, you know? It's how do we really kind of hold these hard realities within the institution of slavery?
That's one of the things that pops so much about in early childhood literature for young children. And I work with 3 to 5 year olds, and I've found some books that I think these illustrations are not right. And so we can't, I don't feel comfortable reading it. And that was one of the things that brings attention, that was interesting to me about Laura's illustrations, was you highlight there's joy in this life and tactfully represent the sorrows and the other aspects of this life. And I'd love to hear how you incorporate, how you think about these illustrations, Laura, if when you're creating, and how much you talk about it with authors and bring them all together.
It's very collaborative. I mean, once I've done my initial sketches, they're sent back, and the editors and the art directors, and in this case, the authors, have input. I was very aware and conscious of trying to make sure that, you know, that the tone was correct, that the mood was right. There was, you know, when you're doing an illustration, you can't help but put yourself, I mean, they say everybody draws yourself, right? And so you can't help but put yourself into the story. I'm drawing an image of somebody, and I'm making the same expression as I am. When I look in a mirror, it's like, you know, like I'm making this exact same expression as the person that I'm drawing. So, I mean, it's emotional, you know, when you're working and you're feeling, you know, like you're trying to, you know, evoke the person that, you know, whose biography you're working on. So I feel like I was really trying to show, you know, how difficult her life was, but I didn't. I mean, it is for children. You can't, you know, you don't want it to be so frightening that people are afraid to to read it to their children. And there were a couple of images where they had me tone down things a little bit. It was like, no, this is too scary. You have to like pull back on these shadows or these, you know, this kind of thing. So I think it worked. It ended up being successful.
And I don't know if it's going to show in the screen, but this is one of the illustrations I think about when I think about that part of the story, that this is a frightening moment, and it shows, but it's not. It can still be processed by a young child.
Mhm.
Another part that was coming back to the idea, about Biddy's life as a healer. One of my most favorite parts about the book is the small bits about the healing plants that she might have used. How did you decide? They go so well with the narrative. How did you decide which ones? What kind of research? Do either of you have a connection to healing plants?
Maybe I'll let somebody else answer.
Laura A., Arisa?
One of the things I found out while researching this book, and speaking about, like Laura Freeman said, about the emotionality, like for me, in order for like to get into the character of Biddy Mason, I need that emotional connection in some way, and not to sort of feel like, oh, I'm writing this narrative because I'm a Black woman, so therefore I'm able to connect, which isn't always true. You have to find this authentic way to root yourself to the individual or the story in order for it to happen. And especially in the way in which we're taught about the institution of slavery, there's always a distance that I have to navigate as a Black person because of the violence and the sense of shame. So I had to think about, how do I come closer? And so while I was having a conversation with my mom while I was sort of struggling with this, and I was remembering something I was reading by Claudia Rankine, a poet, in one of her books, The Racial Imaginary, where she talks about how, Black people, when sort of asked to write about Blackness, it can become plantational in effect, right? So it's like, how do you get yourself off the plantation, and not sort of play within these same tropes around Blackness? And so I'm talking to my mom, and my mom told me, she's like, your great grandmother was a midwife. And I was like, oh, like it all made sense. Like there was this element where I was feeling disconnected. And in that moment for me, it's like the spirit pathway just opened up, and I received some like heart energy and some clarity around that. And then it started to make sense. My mom was an herbalist, opened up a, like a sort of natural food store in Brooklyn when it wasn't popular then. So I kind of come from these people who work with the land and are using the land to heal. So for me, it became this opportunity to like research remedies, medicinal remedies learned by enslaved women, the pioneer women as well, and the indigenous women, how they use the land, and then start to like learn about the landscapes of places that Biddy Mason was in. So what were the plants in Georgia, in Mississippi, in the areas where she was located? What were the possible plants when she was on the Mormon Trail going from Mississippi to Utah, from Utah to California, really learning to reimagine the landscape for its healing properties. And so I just thought like we should totally include that in the story. I'm using this in the poems. I'm using flowers and herbs as symbols, as well as kind of reenacting the different herbal recipes that were used by enslaved women and pioneer women at the time. So why not give the readers a little bit more information about these plants and how they can actually heal and how they can be used symbolically. So it's about healing both body and spirit, and at the same time reconnecting us to our environment in that way. So I just love that we decided on that, and to have that piece be there, because it still lives. It feels like this is a way for the narrative to keep on going, right? Is that we can turn to the earth, look at a poppy, and think of Biddy Mason, and think of so many other layers of history and healing.
It worked for me. Laura A., you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, on all of that, and as Arisa said before, when we were trying to think, how can we tell this story where it's not kind of a hero's journey narrative, but it's really a lot more about community. We were thinking about kind of more of a women's community story too, and intergenerational, and that the relationship with the land is a relationship in that as well. And so having the focus on nature and plants and kind of interdependence and interconnection. Arisa brought in the idea of Ubuntu that we feature towards the end of the book, this idea that I am because we are, this sort of spiritual belief. And I think the whole process of creating the book for us was about kind of living that in the writing, in the bringing input and conversation, and then having the story on the page with all these different narratives, but trying to have a very organic kind of nature influenced or inspired almost storytelling technique. So yeah, having the plant seemed like a wonderful way to kind of have that on the page too.
And I think it was also important too to see, enslaved people, African Americans, captured Africans brought here to work as indigenous people. And that we have a connection to the land. We're not just afraid of it. You know what I mean? We don't all live in cities, but our knowledge, the reason why we were brought here is because of our knowledge of the land. And so I think kind of really shifting and changing that story a little bit in terms of how we think about enslaved folks during this time.
And then, of course, at the end of the book, there's an invitation for young people and children. It says, how can you be like Biddy and extend an open heart and hand to your community? And I think as we wrap this conversation, I'd love to hear if you have a message for young people, for all the grown-ups, that of how do you invite us to continue to heal and make change? Do you have a message? Laura? Hey.
Hey. Yeah, I think that interconnection piece, and especially during COVID, it's felt so clear that, we're as well as our community, right? And that when we focus on ourselves individually, it doesn't work. Everything breaks down. And so I think for kids to help see themselves as part of that we're interconnected, and that all of our well-being and being invested in helping all of our well-being, whether someone's an immigrant, whether someone looks different from me, whether, thinking about the environment, like I feel like, to me, that message is just to see yourself as a part of the weave that we're all in, and find how, I think Arisa really took the lead in writing the part, but like what speaks to your heart. So it doesn't have to be like, go protest in the streets. That's great if that's what you love. And there are a lot of young people doing that right now. But like finding your own way, whether you write, whether you sing, whether just there's a lot of different ways you can be part of supporting community. So I think that would be my message.
And I think, very much similar to Laura, and even to extend Biddy Mason's sort of motto by which she lived by, that, nothing good comes from a closed hand. So really thinking about the ways in which we can open our hearts and open our hands and really do it authentically and in ways that can sustain us and those that we love, those that we don't know, but we want to extend that love outward. And also to just notice the patterns. I think that's the other thing too, is that in learning about Biddy Mason's life, I learned about a level of interconnectedness, but also to be attentive to the patterns, how language may shift and change, but it's still speaking to the same thing. So just be aware and be critical and question and see those changes and those patterns operating side by side.
Be a critical thinker. Laura, do you want to leave us with a message?
I like what both Laura and Arisa were saying about interconnectivity, but also about authenticity and just being true to yourself. And you look at Biddy Mason's life, who could imagine that somebody who was a midwife, or just, was taught about healing plants from her grandmother, could accomplish so much. And so you never know what little thing that you have that you don't really, you don't think is could be that important in the scope of things, and how important it really can be. Just do what you can.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today. And I'd love to bring back Brooke Sheets to the panel. Hi.
Hi. I think it's time for our awards.
Oh, yes. Our awards are, the Focal Award has been a puppet, and today I will introduce Jesse Kingsley, who are the puppet maker, him and his partner are the puppet makers extraordinaire, and we can't wait to see the design you've come up with to honor Biddy Mason.
Great. Hi, everybody. Very happy to be here. Usually, I present this award with my lovely wife, who helps me build it. She's the whiz with the sewing machine. Unfortunately, this year there are a couple of family emergencies she had to take care of, so I kind of soloed it, and I hope you all like it. I'll briefly just talk a little bit about making the puppet and the experiences going into it. One of the things I love about puppetry is it's an art in which you are able to give people or things without voices. You're able to let them, speak. A lot of times it's a block of wood, and you look at it and you go, what do you have to say? And you carve it and you make something, and it does something. One of my puppet mentors has a beginning puppetry exercise where she crumples up pieces of paper and has people attach strings to them and just says, what does this shape say? What voice does this shape have? So starting this project, I just read the book and fell in love with Biddy Mason's life. And I really wanted to kind of let the puppet speak to her dignity, wisdom, love, and also sorrow. And to do that, I used a lot of new techniques that I normally don't do. Also because I was soloing this, the biggest one was no sewing machine. So all of this was hand stitched. And I didn't really know how to hand stitch. So I had to talk to some people and learn it. And I ended up using, I have a friend who's very much into the medieval arts, and she taught me some embroidery techniques. And so that's kind of the basic pattern. So as you look at this puppet, you'll notice most of the embroidery lines are pretty straight. I also have a roguish cat who was very interested during the hand sewing process. So you'll see a line that's pretty straight and then maybe one that goes up. And that's when the cat attacked the string. So my forgiveness on that. Without any further ado, I will present this year's 42nd Annual Focal Award for Fighting for Justice, Biddy Mason Speaks Up, to Laura Atkins, Arisa White, and Laura Freeman. Here is our Biddy Mason puppet. There you go.
Thank you so much, Jesse. We really appreciate it. A copy of each of these puppets will be given to all of our award recipients today. We'll be mailing those out to you. And then a copy of the puppet is always left in the Children's Literature Department for display and sharing with the children throughout Los Angeles and all of the visitors who come see us. The puppets give us an opportunity to share your book throughout time. We now have 42 years of puppets and a legacy of history with Californiana in our collection. I know Uma Krishna Swami is in our chat today as she wrote up Step Up to the Plate, Maria Singh, and seeing that puppet actually inspired me to recommend her book to a child just this week who was looking for girls who played baseball stories. So I look forward to having the opportunity to look upon Biddy and recommend this book to readers and share this story. Now that we're open to the public, we're going to be really excited to install the puppet on display for everyone to be able to see. We'll share more information about when we'll be doing that soon, and you can find that through Focal's website and on the Children's Literature Department social media pages. You'll see the link down below. Thanks.
And if you'd like to become a member of Focal and help us support the Children's Literature Department at Central Library and other libraries as well, and the whole community, please visit focalcentral.org and become a member today.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.